At the end of my last video, we left Henry Thomson of Primrose in Clitheroe and Martha Reed, originally a domestic servant to his family, newly married at Wallasey near Liverpool. It was 1854 and they already had a daughter, Lucy Jane, who was approaching her 8th birthday at the time. Slightly unusual way of doing things. So from there, I wanted to take their story forward. The obvious way to do that was to find them in the 1861 census. But there was no sign of Henry, and there was no sign of Martha. I changed tactic. If their daughter Lucy Jane apparently had descendants, logic says that she must have been alive and about 15 years old in 1861, so she should be on the census at least. Fortunately, Lucy did turn up in 1861. It appeared that she was at a boarding school at Westmoreland Villas at Huyton, near Liverpool, but this is where things got a bit strange. The head of the household was Benjamin Williams, an insurance broker, and his wife, whose name was Martha, was the schoolmistress. Under their roof were 13 female students and one 7-year-old boy student, and Lucy herself. But unfortunately, the census enumerator adds to the confusion here by describing all the teenagers, all the children, as daughters of Benjamin and Martha Williams. I soon realised this was absolutely impossible. Aside of anything else, most of them had been born in completely different places. It did not add up. Very briefly, I did wonder whether it was possible that Martha Williams actually was Lucy's mother. Maybe Henry Thomson died. Maybe Martha had remarried to this Benjamin Williams. The flaw in that theory was that Mrs. Williams had been born in Brighton in 1815, whereas Martha Reed, Lucy's mother, was 10 years younger and born in Clitheroe. I couldn't find Lucy's parents, Henry and Martha, in 1861, but I did find 3 death registrations that looked like reasonable matches. You'll be delighted to know that my pet cat has now settled on the bed, so we may proceed. We are allowed. I found here 3 possible death registrations for Henry and Martha. Do any of them match? And how can I prove or disprove this? One reasonable option would have been to find a newspaper obituary. I wasn't quite that lucky, but I did find 2 interesting items. The Liverpool Mercury of the 28th of October 1858 refers to a Henry Thomson of Blackstock Street in Liverpool, who was fined 40 shillings for a breach of the Sanitary Act. That would be possible if Henry was still alive, but it was the Liverpool Albion, another paper published in the city, that gave me the best clue that Henry and Martha both died at least a year before the 1861 census was taken, and this also connected them to the Blackstock Street address. This would certainly explain why their daughter Lucy Jane was at that boarding school in Huyton on census night 1861. But what happened to her after that? Well, it's worth noting, I think, that Lucy's uncle, Edward Thomson, Henry's brother, died in the Chorlton area of Manchester between July and September of 1868. It occurred to me that possibly she might have gone to live with him. But why do I think that? A few months later, an announcement concerning Lucy is printed in a Manchester newspaper. And now, the next part of the story is going to begin. Just over 2 years after their wedding, Martin and Lucy Jane Speyer turn up on the census living at Moss Grove in Merseyside, Manchester. Martin, a merchant, had been born in Frankfurt, Germany, 42 years earlier. He's a good bit older than Lucy Jane. The 1871 census stated that he was a naturalised British subject, so he'd obviously taken some steps towards naturalisation. Lucy is described as a merchant's wife. Not essential for married women to be described as anything on the census, but in this case she was. They already have a baby boy, 1-year-old Frank. He's been born in Manchester. And we can add to our impression of the lifestyle they enjoyed by noting that the family employed one cook, one housemaid, and 29-year-old Margaret Fielding, who is described as a nurse, probably taking on childcare duties for baby Frank. A year before the census, little Frank had been baptised in an Anglican church, St Mary's in Hume. And over the next few years, 2 younger brothers would also appear in the same registers. A bit of digging around online led me to discover an interesting extract from the Preston Herald, an edition published early in 1875, which gives a fascinating clue about one of Martin Speyer's business projects. The newspaper tells us that Martin Speyer, a Manchester merchant, so that information fits, had been granted a patent for improvements in the construction of portable sheds or tents on the 27th of January that same year. So it's quite interesting to compare that aspect of his business life with the information in the parish registers, because when you compare that date to the baptism date for his youngest child Charles, it would appear very likely that Lucy became pregnant with Charles at around about the same time. So everything was happening for the Speyers in 1875, which makes it all the more annoying that I cannot find them on the 1881 census. It's a complete puzzle to me where they were. I have considered that they might well have been transcribed. I think Speyer is a name that could easily be misinterpreted as something else. But fortunately they did turn up in 1891, but they weren't in Manchester now. To my surprise, they were living at 68 Talgarth Road in Fulham in London, so they had moved to the south. Martin, still a merchant, is 62 years old now. Lucy is still with him, they're still married, both still alive, and the couple once more are employing various domestic staff, a 22-year-old cook and a 16-year-old housemaid. There were 2 other people of a similar age in the household. Not servants in this case, these are their eldest son Frank, who's 21 and a stockbroker's clerk now, so he's finished school, whereas Charles, who is 16, is still at school. Quite interesting for 1891, because you didn't have to go to school until you were 16 at that point. They were obviously well off enough to be able to pay for what we might call further education for the children. So that gives us another clue about the amount of money they had to spend on discretionary services and things to make life a bit more comfortable, a bit better for their family. But did you notice there was one child I didn't mention? There was another baby baptised to Martin and Lucy. Where's the middle one? Where's George? George Speyer should have been 19 years old in April 1891. His eldest brother Frank is at home and he's 21. So it's reasonable to expect that George should have been there too. And this is where the unexpected email that I received in February came in, which allowed me to put this video and the previous video together to tie up the Primrose Mill story. This is where things are going to take an unexpected turn. If you ever happen to find that you're tracing a relative who simply disappears from census records, doesn't appear to have been married, or perhaps even that they died in a place or an area where you might ordinarily expect to find them, particularly if they are from a family that didn't tend to move very far at all, keep an open mind, because people didn't necessarily stay in one place. And that was what happened to George. George moved. My contact explained that as a young man, George Speyer was employed as a general merchant by a London trading company, which would make sense, his family were living in Fulham in the 1890s. George later applied for French citizenship, and my contact's research led him to conclude that George probably did leave Britain before the 1891 census was taken. Again, logical, because he would have been about 19 then. He might well have moved shortly before. He was a young adult man. Like me, he also had not been able to find George on the 1891 census, and that was what led him to this conclusion. So where did George actually go? Well, allegedly, somehow or other, he made it to Madagascar. You weren't expecting that, were you? What became of him after then, I'm not quite sure. I'm not particularly familiar with Madagascan historical records, but I am so grateful that I received that email, because it has allowed me to at least conclude George's story here in this video. At this point, I would never have been able to piece those details together for myself, so I think it's nice just to explain a bit about George's fate and what happened to him before I move on to the next part of the story. Martin and Lucy were the first people that I covered in this part of the Thomson family journey, so it only seems fitting to draw their stories to a conclusion before we look at what happened to the next generation. And a newspaper obituary does confirm that Martin Speyer at least lived to see the beginning of the 20th century, before his death in Brighton on the south coast in 1904. Bearing in mind that his wife Lucy was so much younger than him, almost 20 years his junior, you may be forgiven for imagining that Lucy was there by his side at his deathbed, but I'm not so sure. In 1901, Lucy was not with her husband, she was away from home. She was staying at a residence on Abergele Road in Eirius in Conway in North Wales, so a long, long way from Brighton and a very long way from London. It's yards from the North Wales coast, this place on Abergele Road. and she is described as a boarder on the census form. But I don't think that's strictly accurate. When you study the infirmities column of that census record, you see that she is one of 3 lady residents at this place, who is described very plainly, as only the late Victorians can, as a lunatic. They were very, very frank about these things in the 19th century. There was obviously nothing particularly explanatory about her medical condition or what led her to be there. For that, I think you would probably need to explore something like asylum records and hospital records, which can sometimes be found at the county archives. Because this is Conway in North Wales, I am assuming that that would be the place to go if you were trying to find out about this residence. And 10 years later, Lucy's condition apparently had not improved. She was at a similar facility at Glanidon in Old Colwyn, in Colwyn Bay. She's still in North Wales. Again, I would need to find admission records for these institutions to make sure, but my deduction is that she obviously had some sort of psychological breakdown, some sort of psychological condition developed that, for all I know, maybe they would have been able to treat her with medication today. That wasn't an option in the late 19th century, and so this is why people did end up in these institutions. Lucy died in the first quarter of 1921, so just over 100 years ago. Once more, her death is registered in Conway Registration District, which leads me to deduce that, unfortunately for Lucy, she very probably spent the rest of her life in whichever institution she was in North Wales. It may well have been Glanidon. And what became of the other 2 Speyer brothers? We know what happened to George, we know what happened to his parents, Martin and Lucy. What happened to the others, Frank and Charles? Marriage records show that Frank married Elizabeth Rose Cowley in Brighton in 1907. And following this, the 1911 census indicates that they remained in the south of England, but just not in Brighton. They were living at 12 Mandeville Place, Marylebone in London. At this point, Frank was employed as a journalist. And death registration indexes show that Frank very possibly died near Uxbridge in 1920. So he would not have been on the 1921 census for obvious reasons. 3 years later, his widow Elizabeth may or may not have married William North. Speyer is quite a distinctive surname, so it does make it a little bit easier to try to work out what happened to her, and I think at the moment the most logical answer is that she did remarry. Thanks to my email informant, I knew that Frank's brother George may still have been in Madagascar, but Charles, the youngest sibling, also went off to see the world. Quite accidentally, I stumbled across a very surprising record, which may explain why I couldn't find Charles on the 1911 census. So here we have it. The son of a German-born merchant who ends up in Manchester, lives in London and then dies in Brighton, goes off across the seas and gets married in China. That's quite a bit of travelling. But that's not the most remarkable thing about Charles Santley Speyer's wedding. Like many others, that wedding was reported in the newspapers, including the Mercury. Not the Manchester Mercury, which originally was published back in the 18th century. I'm talking about the Mercury that was published in Hobart in Tasmania. Not the most obvious choice, is it? There's no obvious connection to Tasmania in this story? Or is there? Turns out that Charles's bride, Evelyn, was the daughter of the late William Nicholas, as we've seen, and William Nicholas had once lived at a residence called the Nant in Bothwell, which is about 47 miles from Hobart in Tasmania. But what I've also got here is a massive clue that Charles Santley Speyer went overseas. If he was in Shanghai in 1912, the chances are that he sailed there. Could I find out something about this? Fortunately, I had a handy 3 times great uncle to practice on. My 3 times great uncle Ralph Worsley was a cotton merchant, born near Warrington, and he ended up living in Birkdale and Orton near Ormskirk by the late 19th century, early 20th century. And Ralph comes up repeatedly on immigration records and shipping records because he was a merchant. If Uncle Ralph showed up in these records, maybe Charles Santley Speyer would too. So I started digging around in the shipping lists on various family history websites, and this is what I found next. Not only are Charles and Evelyn travelling, they seem to have a little person with them too, Master M.N. Speyer. And a matching birth record for a Martin N. Speyer, registered in Shanghai, can also be found in the Consular Births collection for 1911-1915. You can find that on the genealogist's website. So the use of that family name Martin strongly suggests that he was likely to have been Charles and Evelyn's son. And the next set of consular birth records, which covers 1916 to 20, also shows registrations for Dennis N. Speyer and Catherine N. Speyer. This is getting to be too much of a coincidence. After this, there are numerous references to Charles, and sometimes also to his wife and children in these shipping lists and passenger lists, and some of them reveal some really interesting details. On the 13th of September 1920, Charles Santley Speyer, aged 45, a married man, arrived in Quebec on the Prince Friedrich Wilhelm. He was born in England, he could read and write, and he described himself as a Protestant. This is the kind of information you get on passenger lists. He was employed as an agent, he was en route to China, and he noted that he had visited Canada on a previous occasion. He had spent a month in Toronto earlier in 1920, so he'd been to Canada twice in the same year. Subsequent records, or at least one subsequent record, also shows that on the 10th of September 1937, an agent named Charles S. Speyer, who is indeed still travelling at the age of 62, left Southampton on the SS Potsdam. This time, he's bound for Hong Kong. This man knew how to travel. His intended future permanent residence was, once again, China. On this occasion, Evelyn does not appear to have travelled with him, but there is evidence that they did return to Britain and they did settle there. this series on Primrose Mill was not supposed to end at this point. This was supposed to have ended some time ago. But I think what I have learnt from this exercise is how very important it is not to make assumptions about the way people lived in history. Do not assume that people were born and married and died in the same small area of the world. A lot of them were, a lot of them did, but not everybody, and especially not those who, as we see in the Thomson's case, maybe had a little bit of money, maybe had the means to go further, maybe got into some prosperous line of work, like being a merchant, for instance, or a cotton manufacturer. That's probably why the story of Henry Thomson of Primrose and his daughter Lucy, his son-in-law, his grandchildren and his great-grandchildren did not begin in Clitheroe and end in Clitheroe. It certainly began there, but it actually ends up in Hampshire, with a couple of diversions to France and Madagascar and China along the way. I certainly was not expecting that.